Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic a little less philosophical and a lot more gilded: ancient Chinese royalty. Because believe it or not, long before social media moguls, celebrity culture, or Silicon Valley fortunes, some people still managed to craft lives so ridiculously extravagant that they made the rest of us feel like complete failures by comparison. Some of it was magnificent, some of it was disturbing, all of it was deeply, incomprehensibly royal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In a world where most people lived in mud huts and considered meat a holiday treat, Chinese emperors were dining on bird's nest soup and wearing robes that cost more than entire villages. These golden little gods were the closest thing to divine beings minus the actual divinity, and plus a genuinely terrifying amount of power over human lives. So what exactly went into being an emperor back then? Absolute authority, obviously, but not the kind of authority where you could just do whatever you wanted. Think complete control over millions of people, but also complete enslavement to ritual, ceremony, and the constant fear that heaven might withdraw its mandate and someone would come for your head. They lived in palaces that were cities unto themselves, ate food prepared by armies of servants, and spent their days making decisions that could doom or save entire provinces. The mandate of heaven was a special kind of pressure. The emperor wasn't just a political leader, he was the son of heaven, the intermediary between the cosmic and earthly realms. When floods came, when crops failed, when barbarians invaded, it wasn't just bad luck, it was a sign that the emperor had lost heaven's favour, which is a polite way of saying it was time for a revolution. An emperor's day started before dawn, with rituals so elaborate they made modern wedding ceremonies look like casual coffee dates. Bathing with specific herbs, dressing in robes that required 3 people to put on correctly, and breakfast that involved tasting everything multiple times to make sure it wasn't poisoned. Because when you rule an empire, paranoia isn't a personality trait, it's a survival skill. If you were lucky and rich, you might be invited to court, where you could spend your time prostrating yourself before someone who might have you executed if you looked at him wrong. For everyone else, watching from a distance and hoping the emperor was in a good mood when he made decisions about taxes, wars, and whether your village got to keep existing. And yes, sometimes the food was incredible, sometimes the palaces were breathtaking, and sometimes the ceremonies were genuinely awe-inspiring. But when they were bad, they were catastrophically, civilization-endingly bad. One bad emperor could doom millions, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it, except wait for heaven to change its mind. Being an emperor wasn't a job you applied for, or a position you could quit. It was a cosmic burden you inherited, usually at birth, and carried until death or violent overthrow. In a world where your word was literally law, every Chinese emperor learned that absolute power meant absolutely no one could save you from your own mistakes. If absolute power corrupts absolutely, then the mandate of heaven was ancient China's way of saying, yes, but make it cosmic. This wasn't just political theory, it was divine contract law with clauses that could be interpreted by anyone with an army and enough ambition to claim they were doing heaven's will. Let's be clear, the mandate of heaven wasn't aiming for democratic representation. It was made to justify why one family got to live in palaces while everyone else grew rice in flooded fields. The concept was essentially this: heaven chooses the emperor, heaven gives him power, and heaven can take it away if he screws up badly enough. It sounds reasonable until you realize that screwing up could mean anything from moral corruption to natural disasters that were completely beyond human control. These emperors weren't just political leaders, they were cosmic middle managers. Every earthquake, flood, drought or eclipse was potentially a performance review from heaven. If the Yellow River flooded and killed thousands, that wasn't geology and meteorology, that was heaven sending a strongly worded memo about imperial incompetence. The pressure was genuinely insane. Imagine trying to govern 50 million people while knowing that every natural disaster would be blamed on your personal moral failings. Crop failure? Obviously the emperor has been living immorally. Barbarian invasion? Clearly heaven is displeased with imperial policy. Solar eclipse during an important ceremony? Time to start writing your abdication speech. But here's where it gets interesting. The mandate could transfer. If someone managed to overthrow the emperor successfully, that proved heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the old dynasty and granted it to the new one. It was the ultimate might makes right philosophy, dressed up in cosmic clothing. Revolution wasn't rebellion, it was divine course correction. This created a bizarre cycle where dynasties would rise, rule for a few centuries, gradually become corrupt or incompetent, lose heaven's mandate, and get violently replaced by the next group of ambitious leaders who claimed heaven was now on their side. Rinse and repeat for over 2,000 years. The founding emperor of each dynasty was always portrayed as a virtuous hero, restoring heaven's will, while the last emperor of the previous dynasty was painted as a corrupt tyrant who had lost cosmic favor. History, as they say, is written by the winners, and in China, the winners always had heaven's endorsement. Emperors tried to maintain their mandate through elaborate rituals, moral behavior, and good governance, but also through careful management of information. If a natural disaster occurred, court historians might downplay it, blame it on local officials, or find creative ways to interpret it as actually a good omen in disguise. The common people, meanwhile, lived with the knowledge that their emperor was either divinely blessed or cosmically cursed, and there was no middle ground. When times were good, the emperor was clearly heaven's chosen. When times were bad, well, maybe it was time to support whoever was gathering an army and claiming they had a better relationship with the divine. In the end, the mandate of heaven was brilliant political propaganda disguised as theology. It gave emperors divine authority while also providing a socially acceptable way to get rid of them when they became unbearable. It was absolute monarchy with a cosmic escape clause, and it shaped Chinese politics for millennia. The Forbidden City wasn't called forbidden because it was mysterious or alluring. It was called forbidden because if you went there without permission, you would be killed. Not arrested, not fined, killed. This was the emperor's home, and it was designed to be the most beautiful prison in human history. Imagine a complex, so vast it had nearly 10,000 rooms, so isolated that the emperor might go months without seeing anyone who wasn't a servant, family member, or court official. The Forbidden City was a city within a city, surrounded by walls, moats, and enough guards to staff a small army. Which, technically, they were. The emperor's daily life was scheduled down to the minute. Wake up at a specific time, bathe in a specific way, dress in robes chosen by servants who had been trained for years in the proper protocol for imperial clothing. Breakfast consisted of dozens of dishes, not because the emperor was particularly hungry, but because variety was a display of power and wealth. Every meal was an elaborate production. Food was prepared in multiple kitchens to prevent poisoning, tasted by official food tasters, and served on dishes worth more than most people's houses. The emperor would take a few bites from several dishes, while servants stood motionless, ready to anticipate his every need. It wasn't dining, it was performance art with very high stakes. Privacy was a foreign concept. The emperor was surrounded constantly by eunuchs, servants, guards, and officials. Even his most intimate moments were attended by staff, whose job it was to ensure his safety, comfort, and dignity. The idea of being alone was not just impractical, it was dangerous. An unguarded emperor was a dead emperor. The palace had its own ecosystem of intrigue. Thousands of people lived within its walls, all dependent on imperial favor for their livelihoods. Eunuchs competed for influence, concubines maneuvered for attention, officials plotted for advancement, and servants gossiped about everything while pretending to be invisible. Entertainment was equally elaborate and constrained. The emperor had access to the finest musicians, dancers, artists, and scholars in the empire, but only those approved by court officials. Every book, every performance, every conversation was filtered through layers of protocol and censorship. You couldn't just put on a spontaneous puppet show for the Son of Heaven. The gardens were magnificent, designed by master landscapers and maintained by armies of gardeners. But even a walk in the garden required coordination between multiple departments. Guards had to be positioned, routes had to be planned, and weather had to be considered. A simple stroll became a military operation. Sleeping arrangements were equally complex. The emperor's bedroom was changed regularly for security reasons. His bed was surrounded by guards, and even his sleep was monitored by trusted eunuchs who watched for signs of illness, distress, or potential assassination attempts. The irony was that all this luxury and protection created a kind of sensory deprivation. The emperor lived in the most beautiful, comfortable, wealthy environment imaginable, but also the most artificial and isolated. He was surrounded by magnificence but cut off from reality, protected from everything including genuine human connection. For all its grandeur, the Forbidden City was designed to contain as much as to protect. The emperor was its most privileged prisoner, living in golden rooms that were also golden cages. Paradise, perhaps, but paradise with very specific visiting hours and absolutely no way out. If the emperor's life was complicated, the lives of his concubines were a masterclass in navigating deadly palace politics while wearing silk and pretending to enjoy it. The imperial harem wasn't a romantic retreat or a pleasure palace. It was a highly stratified political institution where hundreds of women competed for the attention of one man who could elevate them to power or have them quietly disappeared. Let's start with the numbers, which were genuinely insane. During the Tang dynasty, emperors might have hundreds or even thousands of concubines. Not all of them were expected to actually spend time with the emperor. Most were more like political hostages or diplomatic gifts, living symbols of the empire's reach and the emperor's theoretical virility. The hierarchy within the harem was more complex than most government bureaucracies. At the top was the empress, the emperor's principal wife, who held actual political power and managed the other women. Below her were various ranks of imperial consorts, each with specific titles, privileges, and responsibilities. At the bottom were hundreds of palace maids who might never even see the emperor but lived in hope of catching his attention. Selection was rarely about love and frequently about politics. Beautiful daughters of important families were often gifted to the emperor as a way of securing political alliances. Conquered territories might send their most attractive women as tribute. Young girls from poor families might be sold or volunteered by parents hoping to improve their social status. Training was extensive and began early. Girls who entered the palace were schooled in music, poetry, calligraphy, etiquette, and the complex art of imperial seduction. This wasn't just about being pretty, it was about being cultured, intelligent, and politically astute enough to navigate the treacherous waters of court life. Competition was brutal but polite. Concubines had to outshine hundreds of other beautiful, intelligent women, while appearing humble and deferential. They learnt to smile while plotting, to compliment while calculating, and to befriend women they might need to destroy later. Friendship in the harem was always conditional. Pregnancy was both the ultimate goal and the ultimate danger. A concubine who bore the emperor a son could rise to incredible heights of power and influence, but pregnancy also made her a target for other women who saw her potential child as a threat to their own ambitions. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths in the palace were suspiciously common. Daily life was luxurious but restricted. Concubines lived in beautiful apartments, wore expensive clothing, and had access to the finest food and entertainment the empire could provide. But they also lived under constant surveillance, could rarely leave the palace, and were forbidden from communicating with men other than the emperor and approved eunuchs. The lucky few who gained the emperor's sustained attention might wield significant influence over imperial policy. Some concubines became trusted advisors, others used their position to advance their family's interests, and a rare few even ruled the empire from behind the scenes. But for every influential concubine, there were hundreds who lived and died in obscurity. Retirement was not really an option. Concubines who lost imperial favour might be demoted, relocated to distant parts of the palace, or in extreme cases, forced to commit suicide. When an emperor died, his concubines faced an uncertain future. Some might be honoured and cared for, others might be buried alive with their deceased lord, depending on the dynasty and the political climate. The system was designed to ensure that the emperor always had access to beautiful, accomplished women, while maintaining strict control over their lives and loyalties. It was romantic in theory, dystopian in practice, and absolutely central to imperial power structures. Love might occasionally bloom in the imperial harem, but survival was always the primary concern. If you think modern office politics are bad, imagine a workplace where your colleagues have been castrated specifically to make them more trustworthy, but somehow this has made them more ambitious and ruthless instead. Welcome to the world of imperial eunuchs, where the absence of certain anatomical features was supposed to ensure loyalty, but instead created some of the most dangerous power brokers in Chinese history. The logic behind eunuchs seemed sound in theory. Men who couldn't father children would have no dynastical ambitions of their own, making them ideal servants for the emperor. They could be trusted around the imperial women, could be given intimate access to the imperial family, and would presumably remain loyal because they had no alternative power base. In practice, eunuchs often became the real power behind the throne, manipulating emperors and running the empire from the shadows. Becoming a eunuch was rarely voluntary, at least not entirely. Many were castrated as children, either sold by desperately poor families or captured and mutilated by slave traders. Others chose castration as adults, seeing it as the only path to advancement in imperial service, though this required a level of desperation and ambition that's difficult to comprehend. The procedure was brutal and frequently fatal. Performed without anesthesia, using crude tools, castration had a survival rate of maybe 30%. Those who lived faced weeks of recovery, during which they were kept in windowless rooms and given minimal food and water. It was medieval surgery at its most horrific, performed on a massive scale, but for those who survived and thrived, the rewards could be enormous. Eunuchs could rise to positions of incredible power within the imperial bureaucracy. They managed the emperor's daily life, controlled access to the throne, and often served as the primary conduit between the emperor and his government. Some became military commanders, others managed imperial finances, and a few essentially ruled the empire. Their influence over young emperors was particularly significant. Many emperors ascended to the throne as children, and grew up surrounded by eunuchs who became father figures, advisors, and confidants. These relationships could shape imperial policy for decades, with powerful eunuchs effectively ruling through puppet emperors who trusted them completely. Palace intrigue reached its peak when eunuch factions formed. Different groups of eunuchs would align with different concubines, princes, or political factions, creating complex webs of alliance and betrayal. They would scheme against each other, against court officials, and sometimes against the emperor himself. Despite their castration, or perhaps because of it, they pursued power with a single-minded intensity that terrified everyone around them. Some eunuchs became legendary for their corruption and cruelty. They would sell government positions, embezzle imperial funds, and eliminate rivals through assassination or false accusations. The emperor, surrounded by eunuchs and often dependent on them for information about the outside world, might remain completely unaware of their activities. The relationship between eunuchs and other court officials was particularly toxic. Confucian scholars, who formed the backbone of the imperial bureaucracy, despised eunuchs as unnatural, corrupt, and a corrupting influence on proper government. Eunuchs, in turn, saw the scholars as pretentious, impractical, and a threat to their own power. The tension between these groups could paralyze government and create instability that lasted for generations. Ironically, the very qualities that made eunuchs theoretically ideal servants, their inability to found dynasties, their dependence on imperial favor, their isolation from normal society, also made them dangerous. With no family to protect or dynasty to establish, they could pursue short-term power and wealth with no regard for long-term consequences. The eunuch system persisted for centuries because it solved one problem while creating another. It eliminated the threat of ambitious courtiers using imperial women to advance their own families. But it replaced that threat with ambitious courtiers who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from imperial favor. In trying to create the perfect servants, the emperors had created perfect predators. Eating as an emperor wasn't just about nutrition or even pleasure. It was about displaying cosmic authority through the medium of extremely expensive food. Imperial meals were theatrical productions where every dish, every ingredient, and every piece of tableware was carefully chosen to demonstrate that the Son of Heaven had access to the finest things the empire could provide, prepared by people whose lives depended on not poisoning him. The scale was genuinely absurd. A typical imperial dinner might feature over 100 dishes, prepared by teams of specialized chefs who had spent years perfecting single recipes. There were chefs who did nothing but prepare rice, others who specialized in a specific type of dumpling, and some whose entire careers were devoted to carving vegetables into elaborate decorative shapes. Ingredients came from across the empire and beyond. Fresh fish was transported from the coast in tanks carried by relay teams of runners. Exotic fruits were preserved in ice, brought down from mountain peaks. Rare spices were worth more than most people's annual income, and some dishes included ingredients that were literally worth their weight in gold. Bird's nest soup, one of the most prized delicacies, was made from the saliva-hardened nests of specific swallows, harvested from dangerous cliff faces by specialized collectors who risked their lives for imperial gastronomy. The nests were believed to have miraculous health properties, though mostly they just tasted like expensive, slightly chewy nothing. Shark fin soup required fishermen to travel to distant seas, catch specific types of sharks, and transport the fins back to the capital while they were still fresh. The preparation process took days, and the final result was a gelatinous delicacy that was valued more for its rarity and expense than its actual flavor. Safety was a constant concern. Every dish was prepared in multiple kitchens to prevent coordinated poisoning attempts. Food tasters, usually lower-ranking court officials, would sample everything before it reached the emperor's table. Some emperors employed multiple sets of food tasters, just in case the first group had been compromised. The serving process was equally elaborate. Dishes were presented on porcelain, so fine it was translucent, using chopsticks made from ivory or precious metals, and served by eunuchs who had been trained in the precise etiquette of imperial dining. Every movement was choreographed, every gesture had meaning, and any mistake could result in severe punishment. Symbolism was embedded in every meal. Certain foods were considered auspicious for specific occasions, others were forbidden during particular seasons or ceremonies. The number of dishes, their arrangement on the table, and even the colors of the ingredients were chosen according to complex rules derived from Confucian philosophy and ancient tradition. Waste was spectacular and intentional. The emperor would typically sample only a few bites from each dish, not because he wasn't hungry, but because consuming everything would suggest scarcity. The abundance of uneaten food was a display of imperial wealth, and the leftovers were distributed to court officials according to a strict hierarchy of privilege. Special occasions called for even more elaborate feasts. Imperial birthdays, New Year celebrations, and religious festivals might feature banquets that lasted for days, with hundreds of courses and entertainment between meals. These events were as much about political theatre as culinary art, with every detail designed to demonstrate imperial power and cosmic authority. The kitchens themselves were vast enterprises, employing thousands of people. There were separate facilities for different types of cuisine, specialized equipment for particular cooking methods, and extensive storage areas for ingredients that had been transported from across the known world. But perhaps the most telling aspect of imperial dining was its isolation. Despite being surrounded by the finest food in the empire, prepared by the most skilled chefs and served on the most precious tableware, the emperor typically ate alone or with only immediate family. All this culinary magnificence was consumed in solitude, a golden prison of flavor, where even the act of eating had become a ceremony rather than a pleasure. The throne wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a carefully engineered psychological weapon designed to make everyone who approached it feel small, insignificant, and appropriately terrified. Sitting 40 feet above the main floor of the throne room, accessible only by a series of marble steps that seemed designed to exhaust and humble petitioners, the Dragon Throne was where cosmic authority met interior design. The approach to the throne was a masterpiece of intimidating architecture. Visitors had to walk through a series of increasingly grand courtyards, each one larger and more magnificent than the last, before entering the throne room itself. By the time they reached the emperor, they had been walking for 20 minutes through spaces designed to demonstrate that they were approaching something far beyond ordinary human power. The throne room was calculated to induce awe and anxiety in equal measure. The ceiling soared to impossible heights, decorated with dragons and phoenixes carved from precious materials and painted in colors so vibrant they seemed to glow. The walls were covered in silk tapestries, depicting the emperor's divine ancestors and mythical scenes of cosmic order. Everything was designed to suggest that this was not merely a political space, but a sacred one. The throne itself was a work of art that doubled as propaganda. Carved from a single piece of rare wood and covered in gold leaf, It was decorated with 9 dragons, the number reserved exclusively for the emperor. The back of the throne rose nearly to the ceiling, creating a backdrop that made the emperor appear larger than life, even when he was just sitting down. Acoustics were carefully planned. The throne room was designed so that the emperor's voice would carry clearly to every corner, while conversations among courtiers would be muffled and difficult to hear. This meant the emperor could address the entire court without raising his voice, while private discussions among officials were virtually impossible. The famous pearl curtain that hung behind the throne served multiple purposes. It created a shimmering backdrop that made the emperor appear to be surrounded by light. It obscured his exact position, making assassination attempts more difficult, and it could be drawn to allow the emperor to observe court proceedings while remaining unseen himself. Lighting was deliberately dramatic. During day court, enormous windows were positioned to create beams of sunlight that would illuminate the throne while leaving much of the room in relative shadow. For evening audiences, hundreds of carefully placed lanterns created a similar effect, making the emperor appear to glow while visitors struggled to see clearly in the dimmer light. The symbolism embedded in every architectural detail was staggering. The number of steps leading to the throne, the pattern of the floor tiles, the arrangement of pillars, the colors used in the decorations, everything was chosen according to principles of Confucian philosophy, feng shui, and imperial tradition. The building itself was a 3-dimensional textbook on imperial authority. Temperature control was surprisingly sophisticated. The throne room was designed with channels that allowed heated or cooled air to circulate, ensuring that the emperor remained comfortable regardless of the weather or the number of people crowded into the space. Meanwhile, visitors often found themselves uncomfortably hot or cold, adding physical discomfort to their psychological intimidation. Guards were positioned throughout the space, but in a way that made them appear to be part of the architecture. They stood so still and wore such elaborate uniforms that visitors might not immediately realize how many armed men were watching their every movement. The emperor was protected by what appeared to be decorative statues that could spring into action at a moment's notice. The famous daily routine of approaching the throne became a performance piece in itself. Officials would arrive before dawn, arrange themselves in precise formations according to rank and function, and then wait in absolute silence for the emperor to appear. When he finally emerged and took his place on the throne, the entire court would prostrate themselves in unison, creating a human carpet of submission. Even the emperor's movements were choreographed. He would approach the throne slowly, his robes designed to make each step appear to flow like water, and seat himself with movements so controlled they seemed otherworldly. Everything about the experience was designed to suggest that this was not a mortal man sitting in a chair, but a divine being temporarily gracing humanity with his presence. The throne room was theatre, temple, and torture chamber all in one. It was where the abstract concept of imperial authority became concrete reality, where political power was transformed into physical space, and where every person who entered was reminded of their place in the cosmic order. It was architecture as propaganda, and it was devastatingly effective. If you thought your workplace had too many meetings, imagine a job where half your time was spent in elaborate ceremonies designed to maintain cosmic order through the medium of synchronized bowing. Imperial court ceremonies weren't just traditions or social events. They were considered essential to keeping the universe functioning properly, which made them simultaneously the most important and most tedious activities in human history. The morning court session was a daily masterpiece of organized prostration. Beginning before dawn, officials would gather in the pre-dawn darkness and arrange themselves in precise formations based on rank, department, and current imperial favor. The slightest mistake in positioning could be interpreted as disrespect, incompetence, or treasonous intent. So everyone involved spent considerable time memorizing exactly where to stand and when to move. When the emperor finally appeared, the entire assembly would perform the kowtow, a 9-part prostration sequence that involved kneeling, bowing, and touching foreheads to the ground in specific patterns. This wasn't a quick nod of respect. This was a full-body submission that took several minutes to complete properly and left everyone's robes dirty and their dignity somewhat compromised. Seasonal ceremonies were even more elaborate. The emperor had to personally welcome spring, summer, autumn, and winter through specific rituals that demonstrated his role as intermediary between heaven and earth. These ceremonies could last for days, and involved costume changes, symbolic foods, prescribed movements, and carefully timed speeches that had to be delivered exactly as written by imperial scholars. Religious festivals required the emperor to perform sacrifice ceremonies that were part theatre, part theology, and part very expensive barbecue. Animals were slaughtered according to ancient prescriptions. Their meat was prepared in ways that hadn't changed for centuries, and the emperor had to consume specific portions while wearing particular robes and reciting prayers that took years to memorize. The New Year celebration was the ultimate ceremonial marathon. For weeks leading up to the holiday, court officials prepared elaborate presentations, gifts were collected from across the empire, and every detail of the celebration was planned, rehearsed, and refined. The emperor had to participate in dozens of separate ceremonies, each with its own costume, script, and symbolic meaning. Diplomatic ceremonies were exercises in competitive dignity. When foreign ambassadors visited the court, elaborate protocols were followed to demonstrate Chinese superiority, while technically showing respect for the visitors. This involved careful choreography of entrances, precisely calculated gift exchanges, and seating arrangements that required advanced degrees in political geometry to understand. Wedding ceremonies for imperial family members were weeks-long spectacles that combined religious ritual, political theatre, and extremely expensive party planning. Every detail was prescribed by tradition, from the colours of the clothing to the specific foods served to the exact number of musicians required for each segment of the celebration. Funeral ceremonies were even more elaborate and significantly more depressing. When an emperor died, the court entered a period of official mourning that could last for years. Everything from clothing colours to musical performances was restricted, and elaborate rituals were performed to ensure the deceased emperor's successful transition to the afterlife and the legitimacy of his successor. The appointment of new officials required ceremonies that were part job interview, part religious consecration, and part public humiliation. Candidates had to demonstrate their knowledge of classical texts, perform specific rituals, and submit to examinations of their moral character that were conducted in front of the entire court. Even routine administrative functions were wrapped in ceremonial protocol. Receiving reports from provincial governors, reviewing tax records, and making judicial decisions all required specific rituals that turned basic government functions into religious observances. The exhaustion was real and intentional. By the time officials had completed their daily ceremonial obligations, they had little energy left for plotting against the emperor. The ceremonies served as both displays of imperial authority and methods of controlling potential rivals through sheer physical and mental exhaustion. Critics of the system pointed out that the emperor often spent more time performing ceremonies about governing than actually governing, but this missed the point entirely. In imperial China, the ceremonies weren't separate from governance, they were governance. The proper performance of ritual was believed to maintain cosmic order, ensure agricultural prosperity, and prevent natural disasters. Politics and theatre weren't just connected, they were identical. Being an emperor meant that your personal emotional state had direct consequences for millions of people, which is exactly as terrifying as it sounds. A bad night's sleep could result in a province being overtaxed, a disagreement with a concubine could lead to a military campaign, and chronic indigestion could literally reshape the empire's foreign policy. The emperor's daily schedule was packed with decisions that would affect generations. Provincial governors sent reports about floods, droughts, famines, and rebellions, each requiring immediate imperial response. Military commanders requested reinforcements, funding, and strategic direction for campaigns against foreign enemies or domestic rebels. Government officials needed approval for everything from tax policies to infrastructure projects. The scale of these decisions was genuinely overwhelming. A single imperial edict could mobilize hundreds of thousands of workers for canal construction, redirect food supplies from one province to another, or commit the empire to wars that would last for decades. The emperor was expected to make these choices quickly, correctly, and with limited information about complex situations happening thousands of miles away. Personal relationships complicated everything. If the emperor favored a particular concubine, her family members might receive government appointments they weren't qualified for. If he disliked a court official, entire policy initiatives could be abandoned or reversed out of spite. The empire's direction was often determined less by rational planning than by imperial mood swings and personal grudges. The information problem was staggering. Everything the emperor knew about conditions outside the palace came through layers of court officials, provincial governors, and bureaucrats, each of whom had their own motivations for shaping the information they provided. Reports were filtered, edited, and sometimes completely fabricated to tell the emperor what his advisors thought he wanted to hear. Natural disasters required immediate imperial response, but the emperor often learned about them weeks or months after they occurred. By the time he heard about a flood, famine, or earthquake, thousands might already be dead, and the window for effective relief efforts might have passed. Yet the emperor was still expected to demonstrate swift, decisive leadership in response to crises he couldn't have prevented and learned about too late to address effectively. Military decisions were particularly crucial and particularly difficult. The emperor had to balance the need for border security against the enormous cost of maintaining large armies. He had to decide which threats were real and which were exaggerated by generals seeking glory or governors seeking imperial attention. A single wrong decision could result in successful invasions, failed conquests, or military coups. Economic policy was equally complex. The emperor controlled tax rates, government spending, and trade policies that affected the prosperity of the entire empire. Too little taxation meant inadequate government services and military weakness. Too much taxation meant peasant rebellions and economic collapse. The emperor had to find the precise balance point, often without reliable information about economic conditions or the effects of his previous policies. Judicial decisions carried enormous weight, because imperial justice was seen as a reflection of cosmic order. When the emperor pardoned criminals, ordered executions, or settled legal disputes, he was demonstrating heaven's will through his judgments. A reputation for just decisions could enhance imperial legitimacy, while perceived injustice could be interpreted as evidence that the emperor had lost heaven's mandate. The psychological pressure was intense and constant. Every emperor knew that history would judge him, not just as a political leader, but as a moral exemplar whose decisions reflected his virtue or corruption. Bad emperors weren't just ineffective, they were cosmic failures whose personal shortcomings brought disaster upon their people. Advisors could offer counsel, but ultimate responsibility always rested with the emperor. When policies succeeded, the emperor received credit for wise leadership. When they failed, the emperor bore responsibility for the consequences. There was no way to delegate the weight of ultimate decision-making, no way to share the burden of choices that could doom or save millions. The loneliness of imperial power was perhaps its most crushing aspect. Surrounded by people whose lives depended on imperial favor, the emperor could never be certain whether advice was honest or self-serving, whether information was accurate or manipulated, whether expressions of loyalty were genuine or strategic. In the end, every emperor faced the terrible isolation of making decisions that would echo through history, while never being completely certain he was making the right choices. For all the silk robes, golden palaces, and armies of servants, being emperor came with a psychological cost that would have broken most people. The very security measures designed to protect imperial power created a kind of sensory deprivation that isolated emperors from reality and gradually drove many of them to paranoia, depression, or outright madness. The emperor lived in a world where every interaction was scripted, every conversation was formal, and every person was either a servant, a supplicant, or a potential threat. Genuine human connection was virtually impossible when everyone around you had been trained from birth to treat you as a divine being rather than a person. The emperor might have 1,000 people attending to his needs, but he had no friends. Paranoia was a rational response to imperial life. History was full of emperors who had been poisoned, assassinated, or overthrown by people they trusted. Every meal could be contaminated, every servant could be a spy, every advisor could be plotting rebellion. The emperor lived in a constant state of vigilance that would be diagnosed as severe anxiety disorder if it weren't completely justified by the circumstances. The information bubble surrounding the emperor was both protective and destructive. Court officials carefully filtered everything the emperor heard, removing bad news that might upset him and emphasizing positive developments that reflected well on their own performance. Over time, this created a fantasy version of reality where the empire was always prosperous, the people were always happy, and imperial policies were always successful. Physical isolation compounded the psychological problems. The emperor rarely left the palace complex, and when he did, it was under such heavy security that he saw only carefully staged presentations of whatever was outside the palace walls. His understanding of his empire came from reports, paintings, and performances, rather than direct observation. The weight of responsibility was genuinely crushing. Every decision the emperor made affected millions of people, and the consequences of imperial choices could reverberate for generations. This wasn't theoretical pressure, it was the daily reality of knowing that a bad mood, a hasty judgment, or a moment of poor reasoning could result in famines, wars, or the collapse of entire regions. Sleep became elusive, when every night brought dreams about rebellions, natural disasters, and the constant fear of losing heaven's mandate. Many emperors developed insomnia, spending their nights pacing through empty palace corridors, while servants followed at a respectful distance, ready to attend to imperial needs, but forbidden from offering the simple human comfort of casual conversation. The succession question haunted every emperor from the moment he took the throne. Producing an heir was essential, but having multiple sons created the possibility of civil war when they competed for the throne. Emperors watched their own children grow up, knowing that imperial politics might eventually force them to choose between family loyalty and political stability. Some emperors tried to escape the isolation through indulgence. They threw elaborate parties, collected exotic animals, or commissioned massive construction projects that served no practical purpose except to provide distraction from the crushing loneliness of absolute power. These escapes were temporary and often made the underlying problems worse. Others turned to philosophy, religion, or scholarship, seeking meaning in systems of thought that promised to explain their role in the cosmic order. Taoist emperors might retreat into mystical contemplation, while Confucian rulers threw themselves into the study of classical texts that outlined ideal imperial behavior. But intellectual pursuits couldn't solve the fundamental problem of being trapped in a role that isolated them from normal human experience. The most tragic cases were child emperors who grew up knowing nothing except palace life. These rulers often developed into adults who were completely unprepared for the realities of governing, but had been trained since birth to believe they were divinely appointed to make life and death decisions for millions of people. The combination of absolute power and emotional immaturity was a recipe for disaster. Emperor after emperor discovered that unlimited power came with unlimited loneliness. They could command armies, reshape landscapes, and rewrite laws, but they couldn't have a genuine conversation with another human being. They lived in the most beautiful buildings ever constructed, ate the finest food ever prepared, and wore clothing worth more than entire cities. But they experienced it all in profound isolation. The palace that protected them from physical harm became a psychological prison. The protocols that demonstrated their divine authority prevented them from experiencing authentic relationships. The very system that made them the most powerful people on earth also made them some of the most miserable. In the end, being emperor meant trading humanity for divinity, and it was rarely a good deal. The golden cage was still a cage, and even the most magnificent prison was still a prison. Power absolute enough to reshape the world was also power absolute enough to destroy the person who wielded it. If being emperor was psychologically devastating, being born into the imperial family was like being handed a lottery ticket that might pay out in ultimate power or early death, with very little middle ground between those options. Imperial children lived lives of incredible luxury and constant mortal danger, pampered like precious pets, while being groomed for a political arena where failure meant not just losing a job, but losing one's head. From birth, imperial children were treated as living symbols rather than actual people. They were dressed in silk before they could walk, fed on foods prepared by master chefs, and attended by servants whose entire lives revolved around anticipating imperial needs. But they were also isolated from normal childhood experiences, forbidden from playing with common children, and constantly watched by guards and tutors whose job was to keep them safe, educated, and appropriately imperial. Education for imperial children was brutally comprehensive. They were expected to master classical literature, poetry, calligraphy, mathematics, history, philosophy, and military strategy, often starting formal instruction before they turned 5. These weren't casual lessons, They were intensive programs designed to prepare future rulers for the complexities of governing an empire. The curriculum was demanding enough to break adult scholars, and it was considered normal childhood education for imperial offspring. Physical training was equally rigorous. Imperial sons learned horseback riding, archery, sword fighting, and military tactics, while imperial daughters studied music, dance, and the complex social skills necessary for navigating court politics. Everyone learned multiple languages, diplomatic protocol, and the intricate ceremonies that defined imperial life. The succession question cast a shadow over every imperial childhood. Sons knew that only one of them would become emperor, which meant the others would either become subordinate nobles or potential threats to be eliminated. Brothers who played together as children might grow up to wage civil wars against each other. The bonds of family were always complicated by the realities of political survival. Imperial daughters faced different, but equally challenging prospects. They would likely be married off to foreign rulers or important nobles as part of diplomatic arrangements, spending their lives far from home among strangers who might see them as hostages, trophies, or political assets rather than wives. A few might gain influence as consorts or advisors, but most would be valuable bargaining chips in games they had no power to control. Childhood friendships were carefully managed and often artificial. The other children imperial offspring interacted with were usually the sons and daughters of court officials, chosen more for their family's political reliability than for their potential as playmates. Genuine emotional connections were discouraged because they might create divided loyalties or inappropriate influences. The pressure to perform was constant and began early. Imperial children were expected to demonstrate their worthiness through academic achievement, artistic accomplishment, and proper behavior in public ceremonies. A prince who showed weakness, stupidity, or moral failings might find himself quietly removed from succession consideration. A princess who failed to learn proper etiquette might find her marriage prospects severely limited. Privacy was non-existent. Imperial children were constantly supervised by tutors, guards, and servants who reported their every action to senior court officials. Casual conversations, childish mistakes, and private thoughts all became matters of state interest. Growing up imperial meant growing up under surveillance that would be considered psychological torture if applied to ordinary children. The weight of destiny was impressed upon imperial children from their earliest memories. They were constantly reminded that they were different from other people, chosen by heaven for special roles, and responsible for maintaining cosmic order through their personal conduct. This kind of pressure would be difficult for adults to handle, and it was considered normal childhood experience for imperial offspring. Many imperial children developed into adults who were either completely unprepared for normal human relationships or so damaged by their unusual upbringings that they became cruel, paranoid, or emotionally unstable rulers. The system that was designed to produce ideal emperors often created monsters instead. The irony was that imperial children had access to everything money could buy, but were denied the simple pleasures of normal childhood. They lived in palaces but couldn't explore freely. They had the finest toys but couldn't play casually. They received the best education but couldn't learn about the real world. They were raised to rule humanity while being prevented from understanding what it meant to be human. Growing up imperial was like being born into a beautiful nightmare, surrounded by luxury but trapped by expectations that no child should have to carry. The golden chains were still chains, and even the most privileged childhood was still a form of captivity when it came with the obligation to eventually rule or die trying. When you control the wealth of an empire and believe yourself to be divinely appointed, the concept of reasonable spending becomes as foreign as the idea of walking to work or doing your own laundry. Imperial excess wasn't just about personal luxury, it was about demonstrating cosmic authority through the medium of absolutely ridiculous expenditures that would make modern billionaires look like careful penny pinchers. The Forbidden City itself was the ultimate expression of imperial excess. Construction took 14 years, employed over 1 million workers, and consumed materials gathered from across the known world. The timber came from forests hundreds of miles away. The marble was quarried in distant mountains, and the decorative elements included enough gold leaf to fund small countries. The result was a complex so vast that emperors could live their entire lives without seeing all of it. Imperial clothing was wearable economics. A single dragon robe might require a year to create, involve dozens of specialized craftsmen, and incorporate silk threads dyed with pigments so rare they were literally worth their weight in precious metals. The imperial wardrobe contained thousands of these garments, each worn only once or twice before being relegated to storage or given away as gifts to deserving officials. The famous Kangxi Emperor's collection of porcelain included over 400,000 pieces, ranging from simple bowls to elaborate vases that took master craftsmen years to complete. This wasn't hoarding, it was state policy. Imperial collections demonstrated that the emperor had access to the finest products of human skill and creativity, which was seen as evidence of heaven's favor and cosmic legitimacy. Transportation was equally extravagant. The imperial barge used for traveling between palaces was essentially a floating city, complete with throne rooms, sleeping quarters, kitchens, and gardens. Moving the emperor from one location to another required hundreds of servants, guards, and officials, turning simple trips into elaborate processions that cost more than most provinces' annual budgets. Imperial gardens were exercises in conquering nature through unlimited resources. The famous Garden of Perfect Brightness included artificial mountains, man-made lakes, and architectural reproductions of famous landmarks from across the empire. Maintaining these gardens required armies of workers who did nothing but tend plants, clean pathways, and ensure that every view was perfectly composed at all times. Art collection reached levels that bordered on obsession. Emperors commissioned paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects, not by the piece, but by the thousand. Imperial workshops employed master artists, whose entire careers were devoted to creating objects that might be admired once and then stored in imperial treasuries. The accumulation of beautiful things became an end in itself. Food preparation was perhaps the most absurd area of imperial excess. Creating a single imperial meal might require ingredients gathered from dozens of provinces, preparation techniques that had been refined over centuries, and presentation methods that required architectural training to execute properly. The emperor would sample a few bites while hundreds of dishes were prepared with the same meticulous care as religious ceremonies. Entertainment was equally elaborate. Imperial performances might feature hundreds of musicians, dancers, and actors, presenting shows that had been rehearsed for months. These weren't casual evening entertainments, they were productions on the scale of modern Broadway shows, performed for audiences that sometimes consisted of just the emperor and a few family members. The gift-giving system multiplied imperial excess exponentially. When emperors needed to demonstrate their wealth and power to foreign dignitaries or important officials, they would present gifts so valuable that receiving them could transform the recipient's entire social status. These gifts were carefully calculated to be impressive enough to create lasting loyalty, while expensive enough to demonstrate imperial resources. Building projects were the ultimate expression of imperial excess. Emperors would commission palaces, temples, and monuments that required decades to complete and employed entire cities' worth of workers. These projects often served no practical purpose except to demonstrate that the emperor could mobilize resources on a scale that defied comprehension. The economic impact of imperial excess was staggering. Some historians estimate that imperial households consumed between 10 and 20% of the empire's total wealth, not counting military expenses or government operations. This level of consumption was sustainable only because the empire was so vast and productive, but it also meant that imperial lifestyle choices directly affected the economic well-being of millions of people. Critics pointed out that the resources devoted to imperial excess could have been used to fund infrastructure, education, or disaster relief. But this missed the point entirely. Imperial excess wasn't waste, it was statecraft. Every ridiculous expenditure was a demonstration of power, every absurd luxury was a political statement, and every impossible extravagance was evidence that the emperor commanded resources beyond normal human comprehension. The excess was the message, and the message was that ordinary rules didn't apply to people who held the mandate of heaven. When an emperor died, the event was so momentous that it required years of preparation and mourning protocols, so elaborate they made modern state funerals look like casual memorial services. Imperial death wasn't just the end of a life, it was a cosmic crisis that demanded immediate action to ensure the stability of the empire and the successful transition of power to the next son of heaven. The moment of death was carefully stage-managed, even when it was unexpected. Court officials had detailed protocols for determining the exact time of death, preserving the imperial body, and controlling information about the emperor's passing. The news was kept secret while preparations were made, sometimes for weeks, to ensure that the succession process could proceed smoothly without giving potential rebels time to organize. The body was prepared according to ancient traditions that combined practical preservation techniques with religious ritual. Imperial corpses were dressed in burial suits made of jade pieces sewn together with gold thread, based on the belief that jade would preserve the body and gold would ensure the emperor's status in the afterlife. These burial suits required thousands of jade pieces and took months to create, which meant they were often prepared years in advance. The imperial tomb was a project that typically began during the emperor's lifetime and continued for years after his death. These weren't simple graves, they were underground palaces designed to house the emperor's spirit in comfort appropriate to his earthly status. The most elaborate tombs included multiple chambers, vast treasures, and sometimes even buried armies of terracotta soldiers to protect the emperor in death. The funeral procession was a masterpiece of organized pageantry. Moving the imperial body from the palace to the tomb site required coordination between thousands of participants, including court officials, military units, religious leaders, and performers. The procession could stretch for miles and take days to complete, winding through the capital city so that the people could witness the emperor's final journey. Burial goods were accumulated on a scale that defied rational explanation. Emperors were buried with clothing, jewelry, weapons, art, books, and personal possessions worth more than most countries' annual budgets. The famous burial of the first emperor included thousands of life-size terracotta warriors, horses, and chariots, along with bronze birds, jade ornaments, and enough treasure to fund a small empire. The human cost of imperial burial was staggering and horrific. Some emperors were buried with hundreds of concubines, servants, and craftsmen who had worked on the tomb, either to serve the emperor in the afterlife or to protect the secrets of the burial site. These people were sometimes buried alive, sometimes forced to commit suicide, and sometimes killed outright. The practice was eventually abandoned, but not before thousands of people had died to accommodate imperial death rituals. Mourning protocols extended far beyond the court. When an emperor died, the entire empire entered a period of official grief that could last for years. Entertainment was banned, colourful clothing was forbidden, and normal social activities were suspended while the population demonstrated their sorrow at the loss of the Son of Heaven. The succession process was wrapped into the funeral arrangements. The new emperor would typically be crowned during the funeral ceremonies, demonstrating continuity of imperial power while honouring his predecessor. These ceremonies were carefully designed to show that heaven's mandate had passed smoothly from one ruler to the next, without any gap in cosmic authority. Administrative challenges were enormous. Running an empire, while simultaneously organising the most elaborate funeral in human history, required exceptional organisational skills and massive resources. Special departments were created to handle funeral logistics, and thousands of officials were assigned to manage various aspects of the burial process. Religious ceremonies were central to imperial funerals. The emperor's death was seen as his return to heaven, where he would take his place among the divine ancestors who watched over the empire. Elaborate rituals were performed to ensure his successful transition to the afterlife and to maintain his protective influence over his successors. The economic impact of imperial funerals was substantial enough to affect the entire empire. The cost of burial goods, tomb construction, funeral ceremonies, and mourning protocols could consume years of imperial revenue. Some emperors' deaths were followed by tax increases or reduced government services as the empire recovered from the expense of burying its ruler in appropriate style. Memorial temples were constructed to house the emperor's spirit tablets and provide a location for ongoing ancestor worship. These temples were staffed by priests whose job was to maintain the emperor's memory and perform regular ceremonies to honor his spirit. Some of these temples remained active for centuries, creating permanent monuments to imperial power. The death of an emperor was both an ending and a beginning, a moment when the vast machinery of imperial power paused to honor the past while preparing for the future. It was the ultimate expression of imperial grandeur, a final demonstration that even in death, Emperors commanded resources and reverence on a scale that ordinary mortals could barely comprehend. In the end, imperial death was like imperial life, magnificent, expensive, carefully orchestrated, and designed to demonstrate that some people were simply different from everyone else, destined for greatness even in their final moments. While Chinese emperors were perfecting the art of divine autocracy, rulers in other parts of the ancient world were developing their own distinctive approaches to absolute power, each culture adding its own unique blend of luxury, paranoia, and cosmic authority to the universal challenge of being treated like a god while remaining fundamentally human. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs faced the interesting challenge of being considered actual gods, rather than merely god-appointed rulers. This wasn't symbolic divinity, it was literal worship. Pharaohs were believed to be incarnations of the god Horus during their lifetimes, and would become Osiris after death. This meant that royal life was essentially a full-time religious performance, where every action had cosmic significance, and every decision was a manifestation of divine will. Egyptian royal life was centered around maintaining Ma'at, the concept of cosmic order and balance. Pharaohs were responsible, not just for governing the kingdom, but for keeping the universe functioning properly through their personal conduct and religious observances. When the Nile flooded at the right time, it was because the pharaoh was fulfilling his divine role correctly. When crops failed or enemies invaded, it suggested the pharaoh was failing in his cosmic duties. The famous golden burial mask of Tutankhamun gives us a glimpse into Egyptian royal excess. Made from over 20 pounds of solid gold and decorated with precious stones, it was just one piece of burial equipment for a relatively minor pharaoh who died young. Major pharaohs were buried with treasures so vast that their tombs were essentially underground museums of Egyptian wealth and craftsmanship. Persian kings developed a different approach to royal authority, creating an empire so vast that effective rule required constant movement and elaborate communication systems. The Achaemenid Persian Empire stretched from India to Greece, which meant that Persian kings spent much of their time traveling between regional capitals, each with its own palace complex designed to demonstrate imperial power to local populations. The Persian court developed sophisticated protocols for managing cultural diversity within the empire. Persian kings had to present themselves as legitimate rulers to dozens of different ethnic groups, each with their own traditions and expectations of royal behavior. This required a level of cultural adaptability that Chinese emperors, ruling a more homogeneous population, never had to develop. Persian royal inscriptions describe kings as king of kings, reflecting the reality that Persian emperors ruled through local kings and governors rather than directly administering their vast territories. This created a more decentralized form of absolute monarchy, where the emperor's authority was channeled through layers of subordinate rulers who maintained their own courts and ceremonies. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers faced the challenge of governing through divine authority, while acknowledging that they were not themselves gods. Babylonian and Assyrian kings were appointed by the gods but remained mortal servants of divine will. This created a more precarious form of royal authority, where kings had to constantly demonstrate their continuing divine favor through military success, building projects, and religious observance. Mesopotamian royal life was heavily militarized compared to later Chinese imperial culture. Kings were expected to personally lead armies in battle and prove their divine mandate through conquest and military glory. Royal art and literature from Mesopotamia emphasizes the king as warrior and hunter, roles that Chinese emperors typically delegated to professional soldiers and officials. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were reportedly built by Nebuchadnezzar II for his homesick wife, demonstrating that even in ancient Mesopotamia, royal marriage politics required significant investment in large-scale romantic gestures. Roman emperors developed perhaps the most complex relationship with divine authority. Early emperors maintained the fiction that they were merely first citizens of the Roman Republic, while later emperors embraced more explicit divine status. This evolution created a form of royal power that was constantly adapting to changing political and cultural circumstances. Roman imperial life was unique in its emphasis on public spectacle and mass entertainment. While Chinese emperors maintained their authority through isolation and mysterious grandeur, Roman emperors built their legitimacy through public appearances at gladiatorial games, chariot races, and military triumphs. Roman royal power was more theatrical and more dependent on popular approval than its Eastern counterparts. The famous excesses of emperors like Caligula and Nero illustrate how Roman imperial power could spiral into madness when combined with unlimited resources and public performance expectations. Chinese emperors might become paranoid recluses, but Roman emperors were more likely to become megalomaniacal performers, staging increasingly elaborate spectacles to maintain their grip on power. Each of these civilizations developed royal traditions that reflected their unique cultural values and practical challenges. Egyptian pharaohs emphasized religious authority and cosmic order. Persian kings focused on administrative efficiency across vast distances. Mesopotamian rulers prioritized military leadership and divine favor. Roman emperors balanced republican traditions with imperial authority. But despite their differences, all these royal traditions shared certain common features: extreme luxury, social isolation, paranoid security measures, elaborate ceremonial protocols, and the crushing psychological pressure of wielding power over millions of people while being treated as something more than human. The universal challenges of absolute power created remarkably similar solutions across different cultures and time periods, suggesting that the problems of royal life were rooted in fundamental human psychology rather than specific cultural traditions. Every dynasty that claimed heaven's mandate eventually discovered that divine approval apparently came with an expiration date. The collapse of imperial power was never just a political event. It was a cosmic catastrophe that unfolded over generations, combining natural disasters, economic crisis, social upheaval, and military defeat into a perfect storm that swept away even the most magnificent royal traditions. The pattern was remarkably consistent across Chinese history. Dynasties would begin with energetic founders who unified the country through military conquest and effective governance. These early emperors typically lived relatively simple lives, maintained close connections with their military commanders, and focused on practical problems like taxation, infrastructure, and border defense. Success bred excess, and excess bred weakness. Later generations of imperial families, born into luxury and isolated from the realities of governance, would lose touch with the practical skills that had built the dynasty. Palace life became more elaborate, ceremonies became more time-consuming, and the gap between imperial fantasy and administrative reality would grow wider with each generation. Economic strain typically developed first. Maintaining vast palace complexes, supporting enormous imperial households, and funding elaborate ceremonies required increasing amounts of revenue, just as the emperor's connection to economic realities was becoming more tenuous. Tax burdens would increase while government efficiency decreased, creating a spiral of fiscal crisis that weakened the entire imperial system. Natural disasters provided the catalyst for political collapse. When floods, droughts, earthquakes, or famine struck, they were interpreted as signs that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the ruling dynasty. These disasters required massive government response, just when imperial resources were already stretched thin by palace expenses and administrative corruption. Peasant rebellions typically began as desperate responses to economic hardship, but quickly evolved into challenges to imperial legitimacy. Rebel leaders would claim that heaven had transferred its mandate to them, that the current emperor had lost divine favor, and that revolution was actually cosmic restoration rather than political disruption. Military weakness was both cause and effect of dynastic decline. Emperors who had lost touch with military realities would make strategic blunders, appoint incompetent commanders, or fail to maintain adequate forces. When rebellions or foreign invasions began, the imperial army would prove inadequate to defend the dynasty that had grown too comfortable to maintain effective military power. The end typically came quickly once the collapse began. Centuries-old dynasties could crumble within a few years as rebellions spread, armies defected, and provincial governors declared independence. The elaborate court ceremonies and cosmic authority that had seemed so permanent would evaporate as soon as emperors lost the ability to enforce their will through military power. The human cost of imperial collapse was staggering. Civil wars, foreign invasions, economic disruption, and social chaos could kill millions of people and destroy centuries of cultural development. The very system that had created magnificent palaces and sophisticated governance would tear itself apart with a violence proportional to its former grandeur. New dynasties would emerge from the chaos, typically founded by military leaders who had proven their ability to restore order and claim heaven's mandate through successful conquest. These new emperors would establish their own royal traditions, build their own palaces, and begin the cycle of rise, prosperity, decline and collapse that had characterized Chinese imperial history for over 2,000 years. The irony was that the very features designed to protect imperial power, isolation from reality, elaborate ceremonial protocols, vast palace complexes, and hereditary succession, ultimately made dynasties vulnerable to the practical challenges of governing a vast empire. The system that created god emperors also created the conditions for their inevitable downfall. Each collapse was simultaneously an ending and a beginning. The destruction of one imperial tradition cleared the way for the creation of another, often more magnificent than its predecessor. The cycle of dynastic rise and fall became one of the most consistent features of Chinese civilization, a pattern so regular that historians could predict the stages of imperial decline even when they couldn't prevent them. The end of heaven's mandate was never just about the failure of individual emperors or specific policies. It was about the fundamental impossibility of maintaining divine authority through human institutions, the inevitable corruption of absolute power, and the cyclical nature of political systems that grew too complex and rigid to adapt to changing circumstances. In the end, every emperor learned the same lesson. Heaven's mandate was real, but it was also temporary. Divine authority could elevate ordinary men to cosmic status, but it could also withdraw that status with a suddenness that transformed gods back into mortals, palaces back into ruins, and dynasties back into historical footnotes. The golden throne that had seemed so permanent would become a museum piece. The forbidden city that had housed divine authority would become a tourist attraction, and the imperial traditions that had shaped millions of lives would become subjects for academic study and late-night historical documentaries, designed to help people fall asleep. But perhaps that's the most fitting end for royal traditions, that were always more about magnificent theatre than sustainable governance. In transforming absolute power into entertainment, we've found the perfect way to honour imperial grandeur while avoiding its devastating human costs. Ancient Chinese emperors may have lost heaven's mandate, but they've gained something arguably more valuable: the ability to fascinate and educate without actually ruling anyone. While we've touched on concubines, the full scope of the imperial harem deserves its own exploration, because it was essentially a parallel civilization existing within the palace walls. This wasn't just a collection of beautiful women waiting around for imperial attention. It was a complex society with its own economy, politics, hierarchy, and culture that operated according to rules so intricate they would make modern corporate structures look simple. The numbers alone were staggering. During the Tang dynasty, the imperial harem could house up to 40,000 women, though not all were concubines in the romantic sense. The harem included imperial wives and consorts, but also female servants, entertainers, craftswomen, guards, and administrators. It was a city populated entirely by women, governed by women, and dedicated to serving the needs of one man who might interact with only a tiny fraction of its inhabitants. The hierarchy was more complex than the imperial government itself. At the top sat the empress, who wielded real political power and managed the harem like a CEO running a major corporation. Below her were various ranks of imperial consorts, each with specific titles, privileges, and responsibilities that were as carefully defined as any government position. The palace rankings read like a medieval corporate ladder: noble consort, virtuous consort, worthy consort, and dozens of other titles that indicated precise levels of status, income, and access to imperial attention. Each rank came with specific clothing allowances, living quarters, numbers of personal servants, and dietary privileges. Moving up or down this hierarchy could mean the difference between luxury and mere survival. Daily life in the harem was a mixture of boredom and terror, luxury and competition. Women spent their days in elaborate beauty routines, studying arts and literature, practicing music and dance, and engaging in the complex social maneuvering necessary to survive in an environment where hundreds of intelligent, ambitious women were competing for the attention of one man. The economics of the harem were substantial enough to affect the imperial budget. Feeding, clothing, and housing tens of thousands of women required massive resources. The harem had its own kitchens, workshops, gardens, and administrative offices. It employed thousands of eunuchs as managers and guards, and maintained elaborate systems for everything from laundry to entertainment. Education within the harem was surprisingly sophisticated. Many women became accomplished poets, painters, calligraphers, and musicians. Some gained enough influence to affect imperial policy through their cultural knowledge and political insights. The harem produced scholars, artists, and informal advisors who shaped imperial decisions from behind the scenes. The selection process was both systematic and arbitrary. Some women entered as political gifts from noble families seeking imperial favor. Others were chosen from among the daughters of court officials. A few were recruited through empire-wide beauty competitions that were essentially talent shows with life-altering consequences. Competition was constant but subtle. Women had to outshine their rivals while appearing humble and selfless. They mastered the art of strategic friendship, temporary alliances, and elegant backstabbing. The most successful concubines were those who could navigate palace politics with the skill of professional diplomats, while maintaining the appearance of innocent beauty. Pregnancy was the ultimate prize and the ultimate danger. A woman who bore the emperor a son could rise to incredible heights of power and influence, but pregnancy also made her a target for rivals who saw her success as a threat to their own ambitions. The infant mortality rate in the imperial harem was suspiciously high, and many pregnancies ended in mysterious accidents. The psychological toll was immense. Women entered the harem as teenagers and might spend decades in an environment where genuine friendships were dangerous. Romantic love was a luxury they couldn't afford, and their entire future depended on the whims of a man they might barely know. Many developed depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues that were interpreted as moral failings rather than understandable responses to impossible circumstances. Some women found ways to gain real power within the system. Wu Zetian, the only woman to officially rule China as emperor in her own right, began as a low-ranking concubine and worked her way through the harem hierarchy before eventually seizing the throne itself. Her story demonstrates both the potential for advancement within the system and the extraordinary ruthlessness required to achieve it. The harem had its own culture of entertainment and intellectual life. Women organized poetry competitions, philosophical discussions, and artistic collaborations. They created their own literature, music, and art that reflected their unique experiences and perspectives. Some of the finest Chinese poetry was written by women who lived their entire adult lives within the palace walls. Retirement from the harem was rarely voluntary and often unpleasant. Women who lost imperial favor might be demoted to servants, exiled to remote parts of the palace, or in extreme cases, forced to commit suicide. When an emperor died, his concubines faced an uncertain future that could range from comfortable retirement to being buried alive with their deceased lord. The harem system reflected the broader contradictions of imperial life. It created opportunities for some women to gain education, influence, and luxury that would have been impossible in the outside world, while simultaneously trapping them in an artificial environment where their humanity was subordinated to their function as imperial possessions. In the end, the imperial harem was a microcosm of the empire itself. Magnificent, complex, ruthlessly hierarchical, and fundamentally designed to serve the needs of absolute power, regardless of the human cost to those who lived within its beautiful, suffocating embrace. Behind every paranoid emperor stood an equally paranoid intelligence apparatus, designed to monitor, control, and when necessary, eliminate threats to imperial power. The Chinese secret police weren't just law enforcement, they were the emperor's extended nervous system, reaching into every corner of the empire to gather information and enforce loyalty through methods that ranged from subtle surveillance to creative torture. The most famous of these organizations was the Jinyi Wei, or embroidered uniform guard, established during the Ming dynasty. Despite their elegant name, they were essentially imperial secret police, with uniforms so distinctive that seeing one approaching was enough to make most people reconsider whatever they had been planning to do. They reported directly to the emperor, bypassed normal judicial procedures, and operated with authority that made them more feared than natural disasters. The Jinyi Wei were recruited from military families and trained not just in martial arts and weapons, but in investigation techniques, interrogation methods, and the subtle art of blending into civilian populations while gathering intelligence. They were the emperor's personal spies, bodyguards, and executioners, all rolled into one organization that answered to no one except the Son of Heaven himself. Their surveillance network was genuinely impressive and deeply unsettling. Agents were planted throughout the government bureaucracy, in merchant guilds, among scholars and artists, and even within noble families. They maintained detailed files on anyone who might pose a threat to imperial power, which included basically everyone who held any position of influence or authority. The information they gathered was staggering in its scope and paranoid attention to detail. Reports included not just political activities and suspicious conversations, but personal habits, family relationships, financial status, sexual behavior, and any other information that might be used to predict future loyalty or identify potential weaknesses that could be exploited. Interrogation techniques were sophisticated and horrifying. The Jin Wei developed methods of extracting information that were designed to be both physically and psychologically devastating. They understood that the threat of torture was often more effective than torture itself, and they cultivated reputations for cruelty that made most people confess to crimes they hadn't committed, rather than risk experiencing their investigative methods. The organization had its own prisons, courts, and execution grounds that operated outside the normal judicial system. Suspects could be arrested, tried, and executed without ever appearing in a regular court or having their cases reviewed by normal legal authorities. This parallel justice system was designed to handle threats to imperial security with speed and secrecy that conventional law enforcement couldn't provide. Corruption within the secret police was inevitable and often encouraged. Agents were allowed to enrich themselves through their positions as long as their primary loyalty remained with the emperor. This created a system where imperial spies became wealthy and powerful through extortion, bribery, and abuse of their authority, which made them even more dependent on imperial protection. The psychological impact on society was profound. When everyone knew they might be under surveillance, when casual conversations could be reported as seditious activity, and when expressing dissatisfaction with government policies could result in midnight arrests, the entire culture became more cautious, more conformist, and more focused on demonstrating loyalty rather than pursuing independent thought. Ironically, the secret police often became threats to the emperors they were designed to protect. Organizations with unlimited authority, vast resources, and detailed knowledge of government operations inevitably developed their own political agendas. Some secret police commanders accumulated enough power to manipulate or even overthrow the emperors they served. The intelligence reports that reached the emperor were filtered through layers of agents, analysts, and administrators, each of whom had their own motivations for emphasizing certain types of information while downplaying others. This meant that emperors often received distorted pictures of reality that reflected the biases and interests of their intelligence apparatus, rather than actual conditions in the empire. Counter-surveillance became a survival skill for anyone involved in government or intellectual life. Officials learned to conduct sensitive conversations in code, to meet in locations that were difficult to monitor, and to maintain multiple versions of their true opinions depending on who might be listening. The result was a culture of elaborate deception, where everyone was performing loyalty while pursuing their own interests. The secret police also served important practical functions that went beyond political repression. They gathered intelligence about foreign threats, monitored economic conditions that might lead to rebellion, and provided the emperor with information about natural disasters, crop failures, and other problems that required government response. Regional networks allowed the central government to maintain control over vast territories by monitoring local officials, merchant activities, and popular sentiment. This intelligence network was often more effective than the regular administrative system at providing accurate information about conditions in distant provinces. The cost of maintaining these intelligence operations was enormous, both in terms of direct expenses and the economic impact of widespread surveillance. When significant portions of the population were employed in monitoring each other, when business activities were subject to constant scrutiny, and when intellectual and artistic work was constrained by fear of political investigation, the entire society became less productive and less innovative. technology enhanced surveillance capabilities over time. The development of better communication systems, more sophisticated record-keeping methods, and improved transportation networks all made it easier for the secret police to monitor larger populations more effectively. What began as networks of human informants evolved into bureaucratic machines capable of tracking millions of people. The legacy of imperial secret police extended far beyond the dynasties that created them. The techniques, organizational structures, and cultural attitudes they developed became templates for later authoritarian systems. The idea that effective government required extensive surveillance and that political loyalty should be monitored and enforced became deeply embedded in Chinese political culture. In the end, the secret police represented both the ultimate expression of imperial paranoia and a practical response to the genuine challenges of maintaining absolute power over vast populations. They were tools of oppression that also served important administrative functions, organizations that protected imperial authority while sometimes threatening it, and systems that provided security through methods that made everyone less secure. Chinese imperial gardens weren't just places to grow flowers and take peaceful walks. They were carefully constructed alternate realities where nature was redesigned according to imperial specifications to create environments that demonstrated cosmic authority through landscape architecture. These weren't gardens in any sense that ordinary people would recognize. They were three-dimensional expressions of imperial power that happened to include plants. The scale alone was mind-boggling. The Garden of Perfect Brightness, built during the Qing dynasty, covered over 860 acres and included reproductions of famous scenic spots from across the empire. It wasn't a garden, it was a theme park based on the concept that the emperor should be able to experience the entire empire without leaving his backyard. Design principles combined artistic vision with political symbolism in ways that made every pathway, bridge, and pavilion into statements about imperial authority. Gardens were laid out according to Feng Shui principles, Confucian philosophy, and Taoist concepts of harmony between human activity and natural forces. Walking through an imperial garden was like taking a guided tour through Chinese cosmology. Artificial mountains were engineering marvels that required thousands of workers and enormous amounts of resources to construct. These weren't small decorative hills, they were massive earthworks designed to recreate famous mountain ranges within palace grounds. Some included caves, waterfalls, and hidden pavilions that could only be reached by following secret pathways known only to the emperor and his closest associates. Water features were equally elaborate and symbolic. Imperial gardens included lakes large enough for naval battles, streams that were engineered to flow in patterns that represented cosmic principles, and fountains that demonstrated the emperor's ability to control natural forces. Some water systems were so complex they required full-time engineering staffs to maintain proper operation. The plant collections represented imperial power through botanical diplomacy. Rare flowers, exotic trees, and unusual vegetables were gathered from across the empire and beyond to demonstrate that the emperor had access to all the finest things nature could produce. Some plants were so rare that losing a single specimen could result in severe punishment for the responsible gardener. Seasonal displays were carefully orchestrated to provide appropriate backdrops for imperial activities throughout the year. Spring gardens featured flowering trees that bloomed in sequence to provide months of continuous beauty. Summer arrangements emphasized cooling water features and shade trees. Autumn displays highlighted the changing colors of carefully selected foliage. Winter gardens included evergreen landscapes and architectural features that remained beautiful even when covered with snow. Animal collections turned imperial gardens into private zoos that housed exotic creatures from across the known world. Emperors kept everything from peacocks and cranes to lions and elephants, often in elaborate enclosures that were designed to showcase the animals while demonstrating imperial wealth and power. Some gardens included hunting preserves, where emperors could pursue game animals in controlled environments. Architecture within the gardens was as important as the landscaping itself. Pavilions, bridges, and walkways were constructed using the finest materials and most skilled craftsmen available. These structures served both practical and symbolic functions, providing shelter and viewpoints while demonstrating imperial taste and resources. Maintenance required armies of specialized workers who dedicated their entire careers to keeping imperial gardens in perfect condition. There were specialists for different types of plants, experts in water system management, architects who maintained buildings and pathways, and security personnel who protected the gardens from unauthorized access. The gardens served important political functions beyond simple recreation. They provided appropriate settings for diplomatic meetings, ceremonial events, and informal court gatherings. Foreign ambassadors were often entertained in garden pavilions that were specifically designed to impress visitors with Chinese wealth and cultural sophistication. Seasonal festivals and celebrations were often centered around garden settings that provided natural theaters for imperial entertainment. Poetry competitions, musical performances, and artistic demonstrations took place in garden pavilions that enhanced the cultural activities while showcasing imperial refinement. Private areas within the gardens provided emperors with rare opportunities for genuine relaxation and contemplation. Hidden pavilions and secluded pathways offered escape from the constant ceremonial demands of imperial life, creating spaces where emperors could experience something approaching normal human enjoyment of natural beauty. Symbolic meaning was embedded in every design element. Specific flowers represented virtues that emperors were supposed to embody. Certain trees symbolized longevity and wisdom. Rock formations were arranged to suggest mountain ranges that represented cosmic principles. Everything in the gardens was designed to reinforce messages about imperial authority and cosmic order. The cost of creating and maintaining these garden complexes was enormous and often controversial. Critics pointed out that the resources devoted to imperial gardens could have been used for infrastructure, disaster relief, or military defense. But supporters argued that the gardens demonstrated imperial legitimacy and provided necessary settings for the ceremonial activities that maintained cosmic order. Destruction of imperial gardens during periods of dynastic change was both practical and symbolic. New rulers would often demolish or redesign garden complexes created by their predecessors, both to eliminate reminders of previous regimes and to create space for their own expressions of imperial authority through landscape design. The influence of imperial garden design extended far beyond palace walls. Wealthy nobles and merchants created smaller versions of imperial gardens that adapted imperial design principles to more modest scales and budgets. These private gardens helped spread imperial aesthetic preferences throughout Chinese society. Modern visitors to preserved imperial gardens often miss the political dimensions of these spaces, seeing them as beautiful examples of landscape architecture rather than sophisticated expressions of absolute power. But understanding the gardens as political theatre helps explain both their magnificent beauty and their staggering cost. In the end, imperial gardens represented the ultimate expression of the Chinese belief that human authority should work in harmony with natural forces while demonstrating the power to reshape nature according to human desires. They were spaces where emperors could play God with actual landscapes, creating their own versions of paradise while demonstrating their cosmic authority through the medium of extremely expensive horticulture. Beyond the ceremonies and the gold, beyond the palaces and the protocol, every emperor was ultimately just a human being trapped in a role that demanded superhuman wisdom, endurance, and moral perfection. The psychological toll of absolute power created a catalogue of imperial personalities that ranged from tragic to terrifying, each shaped by the impossible pressures of wielding divine authority while remaining fundamentally mortal. Some emperors retreated into scholarly pursuits, surrounding themselves with books, art, and intellectual discussions that provided escape from the crushing responsibilities of governing millions of people. These scholar emperors often became genuinely learned and culturally sophisticated, but their focus on intellectual life sometimes came at the expense of practical governance that required constant attention to military, economic, and administrative details. Others threw themselves into micromanagement, attempting to personally oversee every aspect of imperial administration, from tax collection to military strategy. These control-obsessed rulers often worked themselves into exhaustion, while creating administrative bottlenecks that paralyzed government operations whenever the emperor was unavailable to make decisions. Paranoid emperors, perhaps the most common type, lived in constant fear of assassination, rebellion, or loss of heaven's mandate. They surrounded themselves with multiple layers of security, trusted no one completely, and interpreted every piece of bad news as evidence of conspiracy against their rule. While their paranoia was often justified by historical examples of imperial assassination and overthrow, the stress of constant vigilance frequently drove them to make irrational decisions that created the very threats they feared. Some rulers escaped into hedonistic excess, using unlimited resources and absolute power to pursue pleasure with an intensity that would have impressed Roman emperors. These pleasure-seeking monarchs often neglected government business while pursuing elaborate entertainments, sexual adventures, and artistic projects that served no purpose except personal gratification. Religious emperors sought meaning in spiritual pursuits, often becoming deeply involved in Buddhist, Taoist, or Confucian practices that promised to explain their role in the cosmic order. While this spiritual focus could provide psychological comfort and philosophical grounding, it sometimes led to neglect of practical governance or to religious fanaticism that affected imperial policy. Military emperors found purpose in warfare and conquest, personally leading armies and defining their reigns through territorial expansion or successful defense against foreign threats. These warrior rulers often proved effective in times of external crisis, but sometimes created unnecessary conflicts to maintain their identity as military leaders. Child emperors, perhaps the most tragic figures in imperial history, grew up knowing nothing except palace life and absolute deference from everyone around them. Many developed into adults who were completely unprepared for the realities of governing, but had been trained since birth to believe they were divinely appointed to make life and death decisions for millions of people. The isolation inherent in imperial life created emotional stunting that affected even the most intelligent and well-intentioned rulers. Surrounded by people who had been trained to anticipate their every need and agree with their every opinion, emperors often lost the ability to form genuine relationships or accurately assess their own capabilities and limitations. Depression was common among emperors who understood the gap between their public image as divine rulers and their private reality as flawed human beings struggling with impossible responsibilities. Some withdrew from public life entirely, leaving government operations to ministers and court officials while they remained hidden in palace apartments. Manic episodes were equally destructive, with emperors launching massive construction projects, unnecessary military campaigns, or elaborate ceremonial innovations that consumed enormous resources while serving no practical purpose. The unlimited power to implement any idea, no matter how impractical, made imperial mood swings into matters of state importance. Substance abuse provided another escape from imperial pressures. Emperors had access to alcohol, opium, and other intoxicating substances that could provide temporary relief from the psychological burden of absolute responsibility. But addiction among rulers created additional administrative problems and often accelerated dynastic decline. Some emperors developed elaborate fantasy lives that allowed them to mentally escape from imperial responsibilities while continuing to perform their public roles. These internal alternate realities could range from harmless daydreaming to complete detachment from factual circumstances that made effective governance impossible. The few emperors who seemed to maintain psychological balance throughout their reigns typically found ways to create meaning from their responsibilities rather than viewing them as burdens. They developed philosophical frameworks that allowed them to see their role as service to their people rather than privilege for themselves. But maintaining this perspective required exceptional emotional maturity and intellectual sophistication. Family relationships were particularly complex for imperial personalities, shaped by absolute power. Emperors had to balance genuine affection for wives and children against the political necessities of dynastic succession and the knowledge that family members might become threats to imperial authority. The transition from crown prince to emperor was often psychologically devastating, as young men who had been prepared for power their entire lives discovered that the reality of absolute authority was far more isolating and burdensome than they had imagined. Many new emperors experienced what would now be recognized as severe adjustment disorders. Late-reign psychological changes were common, as aging emperors faced the reality of mortality while continuing to wield power that was theoretically divine and eternal. Some became increasingly desperate to ensure their legacy, while others grew fatalistic about the inevitable end of their reign and dynasty. In the end, The psychological price of imperial power was perhaps the most consistent feature of Chinese dynastic history. Regardless of their individual personalities, talents, or intentions, emperors were shaped by a role that demanded impossible perfection while providing unlimited temptation and crushing isolation. The Golden Throne came with a psychological cost that few human beings could bear without significant damage to their mental and emotional well-being. Understanding these psychological dimensions helps explain why even well-intentioned emperors often made catastrophic decisions, why imperial power so often corrupted those who wielded it, and why the cycle of dynastic rise and fall was driven as much by human psychology as by economic or military factors. And so we end tonight's journey through the golden halls of ancient Chinese royalty, where absolute power created absolute luxury and absolute isolation, where cosmic authority came with cosmic responsibility, and where being treated like a god was both the ultimate privilege and the ultimate burden. We've seen how imperial life was simultaneously magnificent and tragic, how unlimited power created unlimited problems, and how the most beautiful palaces could become the most sophisticated prisons. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the most comfortable prison is still a prison, even when it's made of gold and silk and the finest things empire can provide. Sometimes the greatest power comes with the greatest loneliness, and sometimes being worshipped by millions means never being truly known by anyone at all.